As we discussed in a previous video, arguments are everywhere. They can be powerful tools to help convey information and foster learning when properly organized. As we stated in the other video, there's typically two categories: valid or logical arguments, which are good and well structured, and then there's fallacies, which tend to be unstructured or not a good argument. So to review, a logical argument will have a claim, a central point, that is supported by relevant, sufficient, and credible evidence. Each piece of evidence has a clearly logical relationship or warrant which connects it to the claim. If this is unfamiliar to you, please go to the video about arguments. An argument that does not have relevant, sufficient, or credible evidence, or an explanation of the relationship between the evidence or claim, the warrant, doesn't make sense, then the argument more than likely is a fallacy. When I think of a fallacy, I like to think of the biblical parable of the wise man and the foolish man. The wise man built his house on a rocky foundation, and when the storms and floods came, the house was able to withstand them. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. When the storms and the floods came, well, the house was destroyed. A solid argument that is built upon a rock-solid foundation of evidence that is relevant, sufficient, and credible will withstand almost any attack to it. Well, an argument that does not have that relevant, sufficient, or credible evidence is going to fall to logic or any sort of attack to the actual argument. As a reader, it's important for you to be able to recognize fallacies so that you can make informed decisions, or so that you can form correct opinions based upon what you read. In a college setting, students should be able to both identify if an argument is valid or a fallacy, and also be able to construct their own arguments that are valid. This is often expected during class discussions about texts. The best way to learn to write and orally present a good argument is by recognizing good arguments when you read or see them. So it's important to remember that when someone is using a fallacy, they can be using it either intentionally or unintentionally. When a person is using a fallacy intentionally, they typically are trying to distract you from the fact that there's insufficient evidence or support to their claim, or that they don't have a logical connection between what their evidence is and their claim. People who intentionally use fallacies often do this by structuring their arguments using emotions, assumptions, errors, and reasoning, or making a personal attack to distract you. I was once taught when I encountered an argument that I needed to check to see if the claim and evidence was pale or not. What pale stands for is personal attacks, assumptions, logic errors, or emotions. If the evidence or the claim or the argument in general is using one of these criteria or multiple pieces of this criteria, I know that I'm probably dealing with a fallacy. One form of an intentional fallacy is what we would call propaganda, and that's often used to persuade individuals or groups to believe or do something that is not founded in logic or a sound argument. Propaganda usually uses the technique of emotion and the lack of credible evidence to kind of argue the point. Unintentional use of fallacies are typically caused by not taking the time to prepare or organize your argument, and also not researching your claim well enough so you have really solid evidence to support it. So let's go ahead and practice this on a short passage. So go ahead and pause the video and read the short passage. Now that you've read the passage, let's go through and identify the argument. So first we need to identify the claim that the person is making. I first look for the topic, which is school uniforms. And then I try to identify what's the intent or the purpose the author had for writing this piece of letter or this paragraph. And I also want to look to see what the author's tone is. So to me, based upon the tone and kind of the purpose of the author seems to be making the claim that everyone in the community does not support school uniforms. And as I said in a previous video, I like to map out my arguments using a graphic organizer, and so this is the typical one that I use, which is just a triangle. And so I'm going to go ahead and write my claim at the top. So now I have to come up with evidence from the text to support that claim at the top so that it can stand on a good foundation. So I'm going to look for that evidence from the text. The first piece of evidence that I see is that the author said that a majority of parents at the school board meeting did not want school uniforms. So that would be kind of my first piece of evidence that the author was using to support their claim. Then that second piece of evidence comes further on when the author used the knitting club that they attend as that second piece, where most people in the knitting club did not want school uniforms either. So there's my second piece of evidence. Now I'm going to look to see if there's any kind of relationship between the two pieces of evidence and that claim that everyone in the community doesn't want it. And so that's the warrant that I'm going for. And so I kind of picked that up in the last sentence where she's like, because the parents at the meeting and the parents in my knitting club, most of them don't want school uniforms, then it must mean everyone in the district doesn't want them. Now I want to apply that acronym of PALE. So I first look to see, okay, is the author making a personal attack? Well, no. It seems pretty neutral. I don't see the author attacking anyone that's opposes their viewpoint in this particular passage. So no, they don't. The next one, the A. Are they making an assumption? Well, to me they are. They're making an assumption in their claim that the community as a whole doesn't support school uniforms. So to me that's kind of a red flag that something's going on with this argument that doesn't seem right. The next one, the L, is there a logical error? Well, again, to me it kind of appears to have a logical error. What if there were only 3 people at the board meeting? What if there were only 3 people at that school board meeting and 2 of them thought it was okay? What if in her knitting club there's only 4 people in the knitting club and 3 of them are? I mean, that's not a majority, that's a very small minority. So to me the logic is suspicious. So again, another red flag. Then I go on to the E, an emotional appeal. Do I see any sort of an emotional response in this particular passage? And for me, no, I don't. Now, the whole topic of school uniforms can make me kind of have an emotional reaction, but in general, I don't see emotional language in the passage to kind of cue me that this is an emotional response to a particular topic. Because there's a concern with the logic as well as assumptions, I can reasonably infer that this is probably a fallacy and not a valid argument. And so I'm going to go ahead and talk to you now about a few different forms of fallacies, and we'll come back to this passage to see what kind it might be. So the first fallacy is what we would call circular logic or reasoning, and this is where you use the claim to support the claim. So for example, Dr. Brandt is one of the best researchers at the university because he's the best at research. So the claim is Dr. Brandt is the best researcher, and the supporting evidence is he's the best at research. It's just a spiral, a circle that just doesn't go anywhere. The next type of fallacy is a slippery slope. And this is usually where an argument starts off simple or benign and basically escalates to the worst case scenario. So for example, playing billiards at the arcade will result in a life of crime as an adult. So it starts off simple, just playing billiards, but it's going to become horrible. You're going to end up in prison and part of the mafia or whatever. The next fallacy is straw man. And this is basically making a fake or weak unrelated argument rather than arguing what is the stated argument. So for example, the university growth in enrollment has stalled largely due to the lack of parking. I don't know what parking has to do with university enrollment. So it's kind of like that, okay, you're arguing something that's not really logical or real. Another one is bandwagon. Bandwagon argues that something is valid based upon it being perceived as popular. So for example, clearly no-name jeans are superior to all others because everyone is wearing them. Well, that's just because everyone's wearing them doesn't mean they're actually superior. So again, that would be an invalid argument or a fallacy. Hasty conclusions is where the claim is based upon insufficient or biased evidence. So, for example, even though it's the first day of school, I can tell that the professor is going to be awful. Well, you don't actually have enough evidence to actually make that claim that it's going to be awful. And so that would be what we would call a hasty conclusion. Another fallacy is a personal attack. So instead of giving evidence or reasons that are logically connected to the claim, it focuses on unrelated personal criticisms of the opposition. So for example, the new curriculum should not be adopted by the college. That's the claim. The department chair who's proposing it doesn't have a doctorate, so he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's just a personal attack on the department chair, trying to divert us away from the fact that they don't have really any evidence to support not adopting the new curriculum. And so that's a personal attack fallacy. And then the last one that we're going to talk about in this video is false dilemma. And that's basically an argument that reduces a very complex problem into only two simplistic options. So, for example, this statement, we can either stop burning fossil fuels or destroy life on Earth. Well, the whole topic of global warming and environmental impact is much more complicated than just, okay, if we stop burning fossil fuels, then we save the planet. Well, not necessarily. And so it's a complex topic that's just being broken down into two choices, which are usually extreme and opposite one another. There are many other forms of fallacies. I've just covered 7 of them, but these are 7 of the most common that you would run into in texts or media that you encounter. Let's go back and look at our argument that we talked about earlier about school uniforms. Now, after we've done the Pale test, we know that the claim, the community doesn't support school uniforms, it seems to be an assumption, and it seems to be supported by evidence that's not necessarily logically connected or could logically be inferred to support the claim. So let's go through the different fallacies and try and determine which fallacy that this particular argument could be. And sometimes an author has multiple fallacies going on, and you just kind of look for the one that is the most general and obvious. So in circular logic, that's where the claim is used to support the claim. Well, this particular passage had a claim and it had 2 pieces of evidence. So we know that it's not a circular in nature. Slippery slope. Well, it had a claim, but then, it wasn't drawing us to an extreme. Like, okay, the claim is the community doesn't like school uniforms, but it's not going to say, it didn't say, this community doesn't like school uniforms, and if we adopt school uniforms, it's going to cause, the end of the world. It didn't do that. So we know we didn't have a slippery slope kind of a fallacy going on there. Straw man is where you have the argument, which is the community doesn't support school uniforms, but then it's being argued by some other point. We didn't have a distractor there, so it's really not a straw man. Bandwagon, well, it could kind of be bandwagon where everybody is jumping on board, but not necessarily. They're not saying that you should support the other parents in not voting for school uniforms because everybody else is. They're just simply saying that because a majority of parents at these 2 meetings didn't support them, then everybody must not support them. The hasty conclusions, that's where we don't have insufficient data or we have biased data. This one to me may be the issue, a hasty conclusion. We don't know how many parents were at the meeting. We don't know how many parents are in the knitting club. So we don't really know if this conclusion is correct. So to me, it more than likely is a hasty conclusion. Personal attack? No, the author doesn't use a personal attack to the opposition in any part of the argument or the paragraph. And false dilemma, she's not really giving us 2 choices to choose from. So to me, the fallacy that it would be a hasty conclusion. So as you read, take some time to try and find arguments and see if you can locate a fallacy. A good place to find fallacies oftentimes is in letters to the editor in the newspaper. And once you get good at finding them, they'll become very obvious as you read, and it'll become easier for you to identify them and write them. Thank you.